All right, then we start in earnest. So, good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome from the three of us, Federica, Sofia, and me, to today's session. And today's session is entitled The Qualitative Nature of Quantitative Data. The goal of today's session is to understand in what ways quantitative data are embedded in a whole range of qualitative practices and operations. And those practices and operations include the type of questions we ask, the reconstruction of data in data sets, the interpretation of the results, our attempt to understand what the data tell us. As we already touched upon in our discussion last week, quantitative data give us the impression of being rigorous and rock solid and something that cannot be contested. If we take a broader view, then we may be able to open up to different perspectives that allows us to appreciate the complex nature of data, the actual complex nature of the data, and that's what we will try to achieve in this session. The rules of the game today are very easy. We have two panelists who will kick off the discussion, so I will introduce them in due time. We'll invite each panelist to give a 5-minute statement, can be 7 minutes, we're not, who's counting, but thereabout, a short statement regarding the main topic, and then there will be an opportunity to ask questions for clarification. That will be a short question round. After we've been through the two speakers, we will open the floor for the group discussion. As I said before, last week too, the discussion series is meant to be an open and creative space. This is one of the few rare occasions in academia where you can just sit down and think about stuff in a deep way. So that is what we'll do today. And without much further ado, I would like to introduce the first panelist to you today. That's Esther Peren. Esther is a professor of cultural analysis at the University of Amsterdam and also the academic director of the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis. Those are titles, and they're important titles, but perhaps more importantly are Esther's intellectual endeavors that cover a wide range of topics, ranging from the analysis of farmer protests in the Netherlands to an in-depth reflection on the concept of living ghosts. And with that, we don't mean actual ghosts, but people who are somewhat invisible in our contemporary society. Esther, please, can I invite you to share your thoughts with us now?
Sure, I made a PowerPoint, so I will, someone needs to enable me to share my PowerPoint.
Federica, could you make Esther a co-host, please?
Yes, now I can, let me see. Okay, so let me just, sorry. Okay, so my first slide already shows a bit the discipline that I come from and how we like to critique everything. So when I saw the title, The Qualitative Nature of Quantitative Data, I crossed out the data because we don't tend to, as literary scholars, we don't tend to think of the materials that we study as data. So I would never call a novel like data something. I had huge problems with the ERC with this when I got an ERC grant and they wanted me to do a data management plan, and I had to tell them 5 times that I really don't have any data to manage. They didn't want to believe this, but eventually they believed it. I could also go into the word nature, which always kind of bothers me a little bit. And then how can we know the world? This was something Federica said last time. And then the knowing, of course, is something that literary scholars would also challenge. Also the idea of the world as a singular entity. So that's a start. Then I wanted to start by saying literary studies is generally not considered a science, but a form of scholarship. And there's a real skepticism about using numbers. And I found a text from 1989. This was when sort of computational studies of literature were first kind of emerging. And this quote, even though it's from 1989, still represents how a lot of people in my discipline look at quantitative studies of literature. So quantitative studies of literature are involved in an act of reification, in the very act of transforming textual qualities of literature into counts. Their essentially process-like character is irretrievably lost. Such a loss may be futile if the respective qualities are peripheral to the object under investigation, as is the case, for instance, in physics. And here I think we can already have a discussion whether this is indeed the case in physics. Whenever such qualities belong to the very nature of the phenomenon being studied, however, the loss must be deemed detrimental. No level of mathematical sophistication is able to overcome the problem that the processes of meaning constitution have been eliminated before the analysis is undertaken. So this is about sort of quantitative analysis of literature that tries to answer questions like what is a good novel, by counting how many adjectives are used, and then under the assumption that more adjectives would mean higher quality literature. That's a caricature, but that's the kind of studies that are being challenged here. This author does admit that quantitative studies can be useful in studying the uses of literature, because that's where you can use surveys and you can use interviews and you can use statistical analysis to analyze readers' responses. So there is a role for quantitative studies. Nonetheless, the general attitude seems to be that empirical is equated to mostly quantitative, sometimes also qualitative in the form of more in-depth interviews, semi-structured interviews, discourse analysis of interviews, and theoretical conceptual work is mostly qualitative. And there's a deep suspicion among the people working on theoretical conceptual level of quantitative research. Another division that's very important is that close reading, which is our main method in literary studies, is seen as a qualitative process. And then some scholars have brought in the notion of distant reading, which is reading with the aid of computer programs. And that is called distant reading. The interesting thing is that in distant reading, this is not arguing that it can be only quantitative. So distant reading relies on close reading. So it's a form of quantitative analysis that relies on qualitative analysis. So there are qualitative studies of literature that are then used quantitatively to answer particular questions about literature. And interestingly, this is a sort of statement that you could make, and you could say that distant reading cannot do without close reading, but close reading can do without distant reading, at least according to most literary scholars. So the problem of quantitative analysis is that it often has a questionable claim of objectivity, truth, and scientificity. And this is also why a lot of literary scholars are so frustrated that a lot of money went to sort of digital analysis of literature, because funding bodies saw this as a way of making literary studies into a more scientific, more objective discipline. The problem of qualitative analysis, and we talked about this last week a little bit already, is that it's conceived as messy, as fuzzy, as difficult to translate across schools or fields or disciplines, and also that it's often seen as subjective. And here, the big frustration is that if you do qualitative literary analysis, then anyone thinks they can also do it. So they don't think that this is a skill that you need to be trained in. This is something that everyone who reads a book can do this in many people's minds, which is frustrating. So in literary studies, qualitative and quantitative methods can be mixed and are mixed, but mostly this takes shape sequentially. And I'm quite interested in that idea of what does it mean to mix methods, right? Does it mean that you do one first and then do the other one? Or does it really mean that there has to be a mixing in the sense that it's not just, okay, so with one method you generate something that can, with a quantitative method you generate something that can then also be qualitatively analyzed. Is there really a mixing possible that goes beyond just having one after the other? And then this is I think my position statement, is that I really believe that if you mix quantitative and qualitative methods, you should do this to use different questions, to answer different questions, or to ask different questions. I firmly believe that if you just try to answer the same questions that have already been quite successfully tackled with either quantitative or qualitative methods, then what's the point? You really need to use this mixing to ask and to answer different questions. And what these questions are, then that's then the more difficult question to answer. And then finally, these are some questions that I thought we could discuss. So the first one is, should quantitative methods always, in brackets, be complemented by qualitative methods, and vice versa? So to me, intuitively, the answer to should quantitative methods always be complemented by qualitative methods is yes. But my intuitive answer to should qualitative methods always be complemented by quantitative methods, my intuitive answer is no. But maybe I'm wrong about that. And that's something I think can be discussed. Then the next question is, are quantitative methods always in some sense also qualitative? So do quantitative methods need to be subjected to qualitative analysis? And this goes to the issue of data never really being raw. So the idea that there's always pre-selections of data, there's invisible exclusions, etc. So it seems that quantitative methods themselves need some sort of qualitative analysis to make this visible and to come up with ways to make this less of a problem. So the other thing is also that quantitative analysis sometimes ignores certain aspects or nuances of the data because of the method that they're using, because you can't take everything in. But this kind of qualitative analysis of quantitative methods, where you start critiquing the methods and pointing to problems with them, is then also risky when you want to communicate certain results to a general public that is very interested in having absolute answers. So this is we see in the pandemic, for example, where as soon as you start talking about how data might be problematic, how quantitative analysis might be multi-interpretable, then people start generalizing that into, oh, the scientists have no idea what they're doing either, so we don't have to listen to them. Conversely, we could also ask, are qualitative methods always in some sense quantitative? And this has to do with things like, okay, so if I'm analyzing a certain corpus of novels, how do I determine how many novels I need to analyze to come up with something useful? So I seem to be doing something quantitative also when I'm doing qualitative research. So do qualitative methods also need to be subjected to quantitative analysis? So do we need to test or quantify, for example, certain claims made in qualitative research? So literary scholars in particular like to make claims about the influence of literature on readers' ideas about the world. Should we be more engaged in quantitative analysis of actually testing that claim or quantifying it? And that was it.
Thank you so much, Esther. Thanks a lot. That's much appreciated.
I will stop sharing. Yes.
Yes. Thanks a lot. That was really great. Thanks. I love how you butchered our even the title alone, all the words in the title. That was very great. There's some room, ladies and gentlemen, for some quick questions for clarification, and of course later on in this session we can revisit the questions that Esther has put up for us there. Are there for now any questions, quick questions that you may want to ask Esther directly? Seems to have been pretty clear, Esther. Wow. Well done. Very good. Then, Gerben, please.
Yeah, I do have a discussion question, but maybe it's not the time for that.
We can return to that then after Frank's short introduction.
I wrote it down.
Perfect. Yeah. Same with me, pages after page. There was a lot in it. Very good. Thanks a lot, Esther. We then move first to the second panelist of today, and that's Frank Pijpers. I keep switching between Frank and Frank. Sorry, Frank. Frank is a senior methodologist at the Dutch National Statistical Office, so CBS for those of you who are Dutch. You will recognize that. And he's also a professor at the University of Amsterdam on the topic of the complexity of formal statistics, if I got the translation correctly. It's a position that allows Frank to use the complexity sciences in order to get a better understanding of contemporary societal problems. So as someone who works with national data, real world data, he knows how hard it is to capture fuzzy realities into clear numbers and to establish causal relationships. This is also something I learned from the causality sessions we did, where Frank was also one of the guests. Is that he said somewhere in the presentation, he said like sometimes he's more interested in the qualitative side of things because the quantitative is so fuzzy and messy already and noisy. So Frank, without much further ado, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lasse. I'll also share my screen since I have a PowerPoint as well. Let's see. Okay, so this is the wrong spot to start here. There we are. So yeah, my background is in the hard sciences, you might say, astrophysics, and I am indeed working for an institute that is very well known for producing loads and loads and loads of quantitative data, or at least seemingly quantitative data. So I was is slightly hesitant about talking here because I wasn't even sure that I really understood what qualitative data actually is. But as I started looking into the question a bit more and the descriptions that Federica gave me, then I think I sort of got an idea. So what I want to show you are a couple of pictures, and the reason why I think that is kind of a mix of the two, and then perhaps move on a little bit into what I think the value is. So the first question that I asked myself is, do I know what qualitative data is? And one of the things that came to mind from my career as an astrophysicist is descriptions of images from astrophysics, from astronomy, where the description is really a categorization, something that tries to capture an overall impression, let's put it that way. So what we see here are three different real images of actual galaxies, so collections of stars in the universe, where one has a kind of a spiral-like structure. So this one is a spiral-like structure, like our own galaxy. This one doesn't seem to have much of a structure at all. It seems to just be a kind of an ellipse. And this has lots of structure, but no kind of regularity at all. So that was very early on. That's the kind of thing that we try to start classifying as astronomers what we were seeing. So at this stage, you could call that qualitative in the sense that you don't try to individually count stuff or count arms or something like that. You just, the kind of impression tells you, oh, this is sort of like this, that's sort of like that. So the images are very qualitative. You can count photons, you can count stars, you can do all sorts of counting with them, but it is still that categorization is a qualitative kind of thing. And there were lots of cases which were kind of dubious which it would be. I'll show you some very clear examples. So, okay, so it's clear that astronomers, hard scientists, do use this qualitative description. And the reason to do that is really to start systematizing your knowledge. And I think systematization of knowledge comes before actually trying to quantify stuff. If you have no clue as to what you're trying to do, then there's no point in counting. If you're counting apples and pears and humans and enterprises, everything all together, then you get something that you can count, but the number becomes meaningless. So the categorization, this qualitative knowledge comes first. So this second image that I'm showing is one way in which it was thought early on that perhaps these different kinds of galaxies were different stages in a kind of an evolution. That's, the galaxy might start out as something kind of featureless, round or elliptical, and then later on became flatter and started developing arms or structure or whatever. So it was one that categorization that started off as something perhaps slightly fuzzy. It started to become the input for a thought process where you tried to systematize your knowledge, try to gain something more out of this collection of images. Again, so far, not looking at numbers of stars or colors of the galaxy or anything like that, just still shapes, fuzzy concept. And much more recently, it's been realized that actually part of what we're seeing here is if you start measuring the total mass, now I'm starting to talk about measurements, quantifying stuff, the total mass in these galaxies and the total angular momentum, how fast they spin, that allows you to then arrange these galaxies in a kind of a sequence or a space that makes more sense. So essentially, by combining the classifications that we already had with more quantitative measurements, started to yield further insight. But one without the other is kind of meaningless still. So I would argue that at least in some cases, and this is clearly with a background in the heart of data science kind of thing, I'm hardly qualified to talk about literature research and close reading. But from that, it's clearly the case that mixed data is more informative than just the one or the other. So that's what I would argue. Now, all of these examples, of course, are taken from astrophysics. That's what I could find nice-looking images for. The same kind of happens with national statistics, because, for instance, if you want to compare different countries and their responses and the way that an epidemic proceeded, it's useful to start classifying and separating out by various countries the various shapes of those first waves, to see how badly affected different countries were. And so you can then start to compare the shapes of these curves. So yes, you can quantify such a shape. You can sort of fit a function to it if you want, but just the fact that the heights are different or the width is different, that'll tell you something. And another example that I don't have any picture for is when really we start also ending up in problems where you really need to reinvestigate your qualitative, your categorization, your qualitative description of numbers. For instance, something that is we as a statistical agency need to report on to the European Union for one thing, is the unemployment in the Netherlands. And now unemployment, you can measure that by actually going out and asking people, and we do that. But you can also try to glean it as information from various registers, and we also do that. And those two questions give a systematically different answer. So then you have to question, what do we mean with being unemployed? So you start looking again at this concept of unemployment. What exactly do we mean with it? And when we ask people and when we get it from registers, is that the same thing? Now that's one particular example, but there are actually very many examples where just by wanting to approach with different way of measuring stuff in a societal situation, you end up getting realizing that your categorization, the thing that you thought might be hard, actually isn't all that hard at all, is sort of fuzzy and should really be treated with more qualitative methods, or if you really want to have hard numbers, then you need to really look very carefully at making your qualitative descriptions match, or realizing that you can't do that. So that's really all that I had to say about this at this stage. So I'll stop sharing then.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Frank. And so many interesting thoughts and ideas, and nice pictures too. Thank you so much. That was really great. Is there any questions for clarification right now? People considering going into astrophysics after hearing this, perhaps? Okay, Cedrica, yeah, why not? Okay, then I would like to open the floor for our general discussion. So we have heard two panelists coming from very different angles, but sometimes grappling with the same kind of questions and having the same kind of reflections on the nature of data, or the nature of, I was going to say reality in the world, but I don't dare to because Esther told me not to. Trying to approach the objects that we're looking at as closely as possible, in the best way as possible, but coming from very different angles, and that leads to a lot of questions. Perhaps there are people today in the room who would like to start with sharing their thoughts before we kick in with our questions. I know Gerben had a question.
But I'm happy to wait for others.
Okay, then John first then.
Yeah, my question actually is to Frank. When I was trained in physics, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, it said it was still muted. Okay, when I was trained in physics, a couple of our professors actually used a lot the expression physical intuition suggests, and then came a claim. Yeah, and my question to you, Frank, is if you say this is a spiral, I would, without knowing anything yet about the phenomenon, you essentially base that assessment on intuition, and trying to find out the mechanisms may teach you that looking into way is actually moving, has been formed, its further dynamics and so on, all suggest that spiral is not precisely what it is. So my question is, what do you think that the role of intuition actually is in that particular stage of physics, and what does that mean for the way it triggers the subsequent stage of quantitative research?
Thank you, John. It's a very interesting question. I agree that the word intuition is indeed used quite often in our education as physicists. The only problem I have with the word in itself is that different people use it in different ways. When a physicist in this kind of setting discusses intuition, it means based on everything that I already know about the universe, all of the other experiments that we've been doing, the collective of built-up knowledge. It's rightly said, we stand on the shoulders of giants. A lot of things have been done in physics already. So that certainly guides us. If we see something that is flat and perhaps rotating, then we start thinking of how angular momentum might influence something. Yes, intuition plays a role. And certainly if you, I think it helps if you have a broad knowledge to be able to combine stuff in perhaps ways that wouldn't be so obvious, that you really get to new results, new things. And there are plenty of examples where indeed somebody, either in physics or in other branches of science, comes up with something that appears revolutionary, but and I suppose it is, but it comes from having combined from quite different subject areas, things, and achieved new knowledge in a kind of a leap that you could call intuition, for want of a better word.
Thank you so much, Frank. I was wondering, Esther, what is your take on intuition there?
Well, I mean, I don't think, funnily enough, intuition would not be a word that we would use in literary scholarship, right? Because we would talk of analysis, and I mean, we do feel that we have a method that is not based on intuition, right? Because intuition is what we associate with like normal readers, like non-skilled readers who would sort of intuitively like a book or not like it, etc., etc. That's so we would want to quite rigidly distinguish what we do from intuition. So on the one hand, we have to distinguish ourselves from normal readers on the couch at home, and on the other hand, we want to distinguish ourselves from like scientists. And that's where we have to kind of find our way. So intuition is something that we would actually not use as a term.
And still be seen sympathetic by both of the others, the normal readers and the scientists.
Well, no, normal readers don't like us because they claim that we ruin their pleasure in their favorite literary work by dissembling it into formal elements. So no, we're not popular with them.
I can't hear you, Lasse, so.
I was just taking cheap shots at the physicists who deconstruct the universe into particles and therefore take away all the beautiful images that we that we have just seen. Thank you so much.
I would object to that. If an Esther would object that by deconstructing a novel, you'll destroy its beauty.
Of course. It was a cheap joke. Adam, please.
Okay, thank you very much. And my question or comment is to Esther, as someone with a literary studies background, and actually this is my field of interest of my work. I wonder whether the issue of humanists as such, this humanist distrust towards quantitative methods in general, is not a problem of education and proper training, starting with curriculum, disciplinary training, etc. And I will be talking also about this on IIS seminar next Tuesday. And more broadly, this is the question of specific academic cultures, where the emphasis is put on individual rather than on teamwork. And of course, this is right now a kind of stereotype, and later on the teamwork is changing recently, but very slowly. So this is rather the question of changes in education and in terms of organizational culture that could allow for a more powerful entry into this, whether quantitative or mixed kind of work, okay? So maybe if we can start from the very beginning and from the education of students in this respect, maybe it could be easier to accept that quantitative data are or could be also important for literary scholars as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I can only say indeed. I think I completely agree. I think it's also a lot of the time unfamiliarity with quantitative methods that make people in the humanities, certain people in the humanities, because there's also whole areas in the humanities that are now very much engaging with quantitative research. So I think it is changing. I think it would help if there was more familiarity, but I also still really do think that it should also not just be, oh, let's do quantitative stuff just because it seems more scientific, or because we have to do mixed methods now because that looks good in a funding application. I really want to know, what then does it add to do that? And what questions can we then tackle that we can't tackle with just qualitative research? So there has to be a sort of fundamental reason for it as well, other than we can do it now and we can do it better and better, so let's just do it.
Yeah, thank you. So this is the matter of question that we want to raise. Yeah, I completely agree. Thank you.
Frank, how is that with your colleagues at CBS? What are their views? What's the dominant view, sorry, when it comes to understanding society via statistics?
Well, I think that the majority of my colleagues, no, I should probably say a large part of my colleagues probably don't worry about the notion at all, because they're very busy with the daily practice of compiling the numbers. So even the question whether qualitative or quantitative data, what is better or more useful, to a large extent, most of my colleagues will say, well, what we are in the business of is producing numbers. So it's evident that what we do is qualitative, period. And I think it's a much smaller section of my colleagues that really think about, well, yeah, that's all very well that we produce numbers, but do we know what the numbers actually measure or represent? And then you get really interesting discussions. Of course, especially when we have different ways of trying to measure what we think is the same thing and come to the conclusion that actually perhaps we didn't really know what the thing was that we were trying to measure. But there's other instances as well where everybody's happily going along counting stuff, whatever it is, and then realizing that, hang on, we've counted all sorts of stuff together that perhaps we oughtn't to have counted together at all, but separately. And then we have to go back to the drawing board. So there are quite a few instances of that as well. So there's a small section, particularly when it comes to innovation, new ways of measuring. And for instance, the Sustainable Development Goals have really created more of a discussion. What exactly is it that we are measuring? And even just by the act of wanting to measure something, do we then create an incentive to ignore something else that really is just as important? So that does play a role, but it's in a smaller section of our colleagues.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, thank you so much, Frank. Thanks. Judith, please.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps also good to add beforehand, I am a kind of a representative of the mixed methods community. And so, for example, also those questions that Esther asked about qualitative and quantitative, what's its added value, and yeah, those are questions we've discussed for a long time, although I must say the answers are not always that satisfactory. But related also to Esther's presentation, I think, for example, her question, yeah, what does it mean to mix methods? I think there's one thing I can at least say to that, and it is that often, yes, we say we mix method, but if you look more carefully what we're actually doing, that picture is incorrect, or at least it's not detailed enough, because mostly we do not mix methods, but we apply one method, say a quantitative method, to quantitative data. We obtain a conclusion. Qualitative method to qualitative data, we obtain a conclusion, and we connect these conclusions. And but that's less innocent than it might sound, this confusion, because I think it has large implications. And the other question about sequentiality, I think the interesting thing is we have now within the mixed methods community also made distinctions between different types of mixed methods designs. And one of these designs is a sequential design, either first qualitative, then quantitative, or vice versa, first quantitative, then qualitative research. But as for example, a reviewer of the associate editor of the Journal of Mixed Method Research, what I always see is that there is basically a third phase, which we haven't described really, I think, carefully in enough detail. But that is after that, after you obtain qualitative data, quantitative, and made some first conclusions, then you have the third phase of really integrating them. And in this third phase, there the interesting things are happening. And there you can, there it's a question of going back and forth between your different data sets. So I would currently say, and then I agree with, for example, John Creswell, who recently said it in his most recent version of conducting mixed method research. Mixed method research is also about getting the most out of your data and going back and through your different data sets. So yeah, that's for kind of my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judith. Esther, Frank, would you like to respond to that?
Maybe let's just hear the other comments and
Okay. Oh, good.
see.
Yeah, we can do that. Federica, please.
Yeah, thanks. That's been very interesting so far, and I guess I have more of a comment than a question that is prompted by something that Esther said in her pitch when Esther, you said that you would like to use to mix the methods to ask or answer different questions, but then you slightly modify the formulation in a reply to another comment by saying, why would you? I would like to know why you want to use, say, quantitative methods. What does it add over and above, so that I have to understand why I have to use this. Okay, so and I would like to bring in some good philosophy of science that may be of help here. Usually philosophers make things worse by giving you concepts that nobody understands. But recently I studied the work of Stéphanie Rouffy, who is a French philosopher of science, and she develops this idea of foliated pluralism. And among other things, her argument is to say, why do we need multiple methods? So first point would be to say, no, there isn't just one object that you study. The object of science and that you study in the sciences is multiple. Why do you need multiple methods? Because multiple methods give you different epistemic access to a same thing that you are studying. And so then the question is what it is exactly that you are learning about this problem by doing quantitative, qualitative, and then kind of crisscrossing the results, the methods, etc. And I really like this idea that you need multiple methods, because then you can learn more. So I take it that whoever is taking part on a series on mixed methods and mixed data research would not argue for hierarchies of methods, and so only statistics is good, only randomized controlled trials are good, etc. But I find that if we have to give a philosophical argument for why we need multiple methods, this for me is a powerful idea, that there cannot be one way in which we get access to a given object of study or to a given problem. And then of course we open the door to what exactly do we learn with one method, not the other, why do we have to do things in one sequence rather than another, etc. So it is only the starting point. But that's I just wanted to bring in some philosophy of science, and if any of you is interested, I'm happy to share the reference with you, because it is a beautiful reading.
Could you please put it in the chat, Federica, so that people can look it up? Because I saw people taking notes. I tried it too, but my French is not really good, so it would be great if you could put it in the chat. And thanks for this contribution. Roel, please.
Yeah, trying to find my unmute button. Well, in the field where I come from, social science, quantitative data is usually considered, is usually used for correlational studies, and quantitative data is usually understood to express data that captures all empirical variation, and preferably it is expressed on linear and ratio scales. That's all very fine, but it makes a very big assumption, namely that you can describe differences in social reality in a linear way. That linear data, correlational data, quantitative data, are a relevant way of expressing differences in social reality. Of course, that's a legitimate assumption you can make, but it's equally legitimate not to make that assumption. If you as far as example I do, come from a case study background, you can just as easily argue that cases differ from one another in non-linear ways, and that therefore these fine-grained correlational scales may not be particularly helpful in describing social reality. This is a thought that I had developed some time ago, and it's just if some of the top presenters might want to reflect on that, or others might reflect on that. How do other people think about this?
Esther or Frank, do you have any first thoughts?
Yes. Of course, with my colleagues as well, we have practical issues precisely the way that all describes. For instance, when we do surveys about how people, as an example, how people perceive their own health. So you can measure health objectively by measuring blood values, etc. But how do people perceive their own health? And then you can ask them to respond on a scale of very badly to great or neutral or whatever. But you really don't have any idea whether those responses, I mean, you tend to put them on a scale from 1 to 5 or whatever, but yeah, the difference between very bad and bad is not the same as between great and okay. Or, I mean, it becomes very hard to relate that to anything that, while the scale appears to be linear, it probably isn't. And so you struggle with that, and it also means something for if you then want to combine such data with something else, with the living environment, or with education, or other things that you might be able to measure more or better on a linear scale. That combination doesn't always work very well. Or at the very least, you have to be aware of the fact that the one can behave quite differently than the other. So you have to decide very carefully on the kinds of analysis methods that you then use. And that is an example of really in an actual setting having to mix more qualitative data and more quantitative data, because policymakers want to know whether by making improvements in the local living environment at a municipal scale, whether that helps in improving the perceived health or perceived quality of life of the inhabitants of such municipalities. So you do want something quantitative, or at least be able to demonstrate yes or no, it makes a difference. So you have to do something with it, but it becomes very difficult if you don't have a good notion of whether any scale is linear.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks, Frank. And Esther, what from your angle, what do you do to convey qualitative messages and
avoidance?
Avoidance.
I mean, yes, because I research the imagination of the rural in television, film, and literature. And to be honest, what I do is I avoid the question of how can you actually prove that when you say that when people watch Boer Zoekt Vrouw on TV, and that's 4 million people in the Netherlands, that they are influenced by the type of story that show tells about the countryside. I mean, I would be very grateful if someone else would do the quantitative research to find out whether how many people actually, how people actually think this changes their perception. But then I also think, okay, asking people, there's also a problem with that, right? Because I don't happen to think that people necessarily know how they are influenced by TV or how they're influenced by literature. So then again, you have all these questions that come from trying to then quantify this kind of response. I mean, maybe here I go by intuition, and I do just sense that cultural objects like literature, film, and TV have some sort of impact on the world and on shaping the world. And I kind of stay away from trying to quantify that. I just wanted to say about Federica's point that I think, yes, in an ideal world, if there were no hierarchization between methods, then it makes total sense to say, okay, we do mix methods because then we see an object from multiple angles and we can learn more about it. I firmly believe that. I mean, I really believe in interdisciplinary research, but I think there is a hierarchization of methods that happens in funding bodies. And if you look at, for example, now that NWO and the ERC have kind of combined humanities and social sciences, we see that more and more projects, even within the humanities, that that are successful, are projects that are actually leaning much more towards the social sciences, and are not the projects that we would say are sort of core, fundamentally humanities and fundamentally qualitative projects. And I think there is a problem. I mean, I think there is a problem when mixed methods become something that you're not just kind of doing because you believe it helps you look at the object better, but it becomes something you do because you feel that funders want to see that and that they do value it more if you either do mixed methods or if you do quantitative rather than more qualitative research. So I think there the hierarchy does exist and it's something that we do have to engage with.
Yeah, I think most of us who have encountered such discussions already is with funders, so I think we all agree with that. There's a huge difference between the ideal world and the actual world of funding and getting projects done. I agree. John, I think you also want to comment on that, right?
Yeah, but if Wouter has something more direct on the main point towards which Esther argued, maybe he first, because my remark is more about what you said earlier.
Yeah, my remark is also about something else, so please go ahead.
Okay, okay, then let me proceed. What I'm actually, what Esther was saying about the question, can you or can you not really know what a program does with people? How can we access the data? That, of course, is certainly not unique to literary theory or to social science. That's also precisely the sort of problem that Frank will be running into when he tries to translate a particular thing into a quantifiable variable and then subsequently tries to measure that variable. It all involves a double hermeneutic. You need to interpret your concept and you need to interpret reality in light of each other. But precisely literary theory has some methods to deal with that sort of a double hermeneutic. So I would also be interested, Esther, we're saying to rapidly, precisely from your disciplinary perspective, that this is difficult to do in social science. Maybe you have the solution for that kind of things, as well as for the sort of problems that Frank is running into. So real response theory and that sort of theories do have responses to dealing with the double hermeneutic.
Maybe Esther, you have the keys. No pressure.
I don't think we will never believe we have all the keys, because that's fundamentally against our grounding philosophy. No, but I do feel that there are instruments from literary studies that are useful for thinking these kinds of questions. And the first one is to always question what you mean by everything that you kind of take for granted, right? So the idea of data, the idea of linearity, the idea of the fact that when you choose to study something, you're already excluding other things that you're not studying, and that in itself is already acting upon the world. So that the idea that what you do is somehow looking at the world and being not part of that in what you research is very problematic. And that, I think, we have tools and concepts and methods for thinking about. But that doesn't mean that you then end up having some sort of certainty at the end of that. That will not happen.
But it does mean that you know how to deal with something that all sciences are fundamentally uncertain, to use that word, about. Yeah, and that is valuable in and of itself, I would argue.
Let's see that Gerben has dropped the question what fundamentally means in the first place.
No, because I was using the same trick as Esther did. So
Yeah.
Yes,
just shaking the tree.
Very good. Maybe we can think about that question for a bit. Wouter, it's maybe the last question for now.
Yeah, it's more a kind of reflection. I'm letting everything that's being said sink in a bit, but it struck me that we are actually not talking that much about data, but we're mostly talking about methods. And I think a lot of what is being said boils down to the idea that Well, when you use a certain method, do you still think about what it actually means that you're measuring, and whether it's meaningful to, for example, express, well, like Frank said, certain things we measure on a Likert scale, and then is it actually meaningful to do it in that way, or are we actually measuring something that's very hard to sort of put on a scale where there's difference between 1 and 3 really makes a difference? And I maybe I'm a kind of a pragmatist. I like I see value in quantitative and qualitative methods, but I do, maybe that's a thought, maybe a question as well. Is it perhaps true that with qualitative research you're forced much more to think about the meaning of what you're measuring, because it's focused more on that, and then in quantitative research there's a risk that you maybe forget about that, right? That you sort of lose touch of that. But it's a very important question. That's also what I really like about what Frank said. Numbers can be meaningless, so you really need to think about what they mean.
Yeah, for sure. Frank, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I agree. Very quickly, because we're very operationally minded quite often in the quantitative sciences and statistical bureaus, etc. So we kind of start with, okay, we've agreed on what we want to measure, and then we start going out and doing something. So quite often we go ahead and run off and start counting stuff before we've really agreed on whether the definition of what we ought to be counting, whether that's fully specified. So it would be probably good to have a slightly more reflective nature, and think a bit more about whether the kinds of things that we go out and count, whether that really is what we're supposed to be doing. So yeah, quite often under the time pressure we just go out and do stuff, but sometimes it's good to sit back and think. I agree.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, thanks a lot. Gerben.
Yeah, I wanted to react to Wouter, because in teaching both quant and qualitative methods, I usually tend to say exactly the same lines as you just did. And that there is a tendency in qualitative research to do much more of the reflection first, and in mixed methods to do the reflection on both, by the way. However, as soon as I start talking with my colleagues who do more quantitative research, they definitely know what they're talking about and what the problem is with their data, like Frank just showed us for physics, or for astrophysics. And I do see a lot of qualitative researchers even from the very reflexive side, who do reflexivity as some sort of protocolized lemming-like way of let's do reflexivity in exactly the same way. So I don't think it's really useful to make that distinction in the long run. And yeah, again, I agree. I do it in teaching also in order to show students, look, that's why issues like validity are continuously debated in qualitative research, and we need new criteria every 2 years. But in quantitative research, there seem to be less discussed, but among methodologists, they're widely discussed. And I really like to say that Frank was repeating the words of Sikoro in 1967 already on measurement by fiat. Like, what are we measuring? Well, we're measuring what we decide we measure, rather than something real out there. And if I may, if I just ramble on, if that's
Go
okay.
on, go on.
Yeah, with regards to ask the same questions of Esther, I was really triggered. Why bother asking the same question? I don't think we ever ask this exactly the same question, even if we do exactly the same research, because there are always questions that we pose slightly differently, or we try to answer them in slightly different ways. So if you would do a literary study, and I'm not able to, but okay, if I would do one, because of my unableness, I will answer this question differently. So I don't think that there's we can fully say that questions are exactly the same. And I could come up, if I think for a long time, with some examples in which asking the same questions and use different methodologies actually is very useful.
Yeah, thanks indeed. Thanks, Gerben. Thank you so much. With an eye on the time, I'm extremely happy to report that we have more questions and topics to discuss than we have time. And this is very encouraging because there's an entire series of meetings. So don't worry about it. We will not solve everything overnight. I would like to thank you all for being here and for participating in the discussion. There's also a parallel discussion in the chat emerging right now, so keep going. I would especially like to thank Esther and Frank for their really great kickoffs. And despite their uncertainty about whether they have all the right answers, it was absolutely brilliant. So thank you so much for getting us going there. I would like to remind you that we will meet again on January the 14th, and that session will mirror today's session. We will talk about the the quantification of qualitative data. Please remember to register for that session if you haven't, because we do the registrations per session and not for the entire series. So by all means, if you want to come again, feel free, but don't forget to register for that session, and then the university will send you the link. Also, I would like to remind you of Adam's seminar on Tuesday on global knowledge transfer. If you want to join that one, then again, please go to the website and register there. For now, all the best from our side, from Sophia, Federica, and me. We really enjoyed the first two sessions, and we're really looking forward to continuous discussion in the coming months. Go to the website to see what we'll talk about, and hopefully see you again at the other side of the Christmas break. Thank you so much for now.
Thank you. Bye.